Hello and welcome to another episode of the All Things Considered CX podcast. I'm your host, Bob Azman. Glad to have you back listening to this episode. And as always, I love having return guests, especially this gentleman in particular, because he always has a wealth of information. John Goodman is joining us today to talk about a number of different subjects that we'll get to. But John and his organization are constantly monitoring the mood of the consumer buying public, and he has some updates for us. So, John, welcome to the podcast. And if you would introduce yourself to our listeners who may not be familiar with you and your organization.
Okay, thanks very much, Bob. I'm John Goodman. I am not the actor, although I get bills for him on occasion. And we've been doing this research for about 45 years. And in the last 20 years, we've been doing it under the flag of Customer Care Measurement and Consulting, CCMC. And our real focuses are complaint handling, customer service, delight, and really voice of the customer.
Mm-hmm. And listeners, just right out of the gate, I would say if you're not connected to John on LinkedIn, you need to be, because he posts a lot of great articles either through Customer Think or on LinkedIn, and just really, as I said, understands the buying processes and trends out there, and you really need to be connected with them. So I highly encourage you to do that. John, earlier this year you run a rage study on a regular basis, but earlier this year you focused in on consumer product goods. And I'd love to have you start there with the podcast and some of the findings you had from that study.
Yeah, we basically what initiated it was that five of the biggest CPG companies, Pepsi, Colgate, Kraft, Kellogg, and Nestle, had said, gee, we've been using the multiplier, which is for each complaint we get, how many others are there out there of a similar ilk. We've been using your multiplier data, but it's now probably 5 or 10 years old, so we want to redo it. So we did probably the largest consumer survey with more than 8,000 respondents, and they responded on multiple categories of CPG. So we had 18,000 responses altogether, where we asked people, what problems did you have with these products? Did you complain? Where did you complain? And how well was it handled? And we came up with a number of very surprising findings. First is that we found that there's a whole new, courtesy of COVID and inflation, a whole new category in a number of these product groups that is called I'd call it value, in that your package is smaller and your price is higher. And I'm really unhappy about that. And we've now seen this in the presidential campaign even. And what we're finding is, to the degree that people do complain about that, the companies and the retailers are not handling it very well, which leads to the next big finding, which was that 3/4 of all the complaints that were filed went to the retailer, not to the brand. And what we found, again, surprisingly, was that face-to-face complaint handling in the supermarket is not being very successful. Whether it's quality issues or price issues, the front line in the stores are basically throwing the brands under the bus. And if somebody complains about your brand in a channel, you're ending up with someone who either stops buying the product or is much less loyal. On the other hand, another surprising finding was that, to the degree that people did complain to the brands about the problem, the brands have actually gotten very successful at handling traditional complaints. For instance, and I can quote this data because Colgate and I presented at it at a conference recently on it. What we found was Colgate had achieved 40% delight, not just completely satisfied, but you exceeded my expectations in 40% of the cases. And we've never seen 40% delight levels in the past. So that really is a very good piece of news. So there's a bunch of bad news, but at the same time, there's a bunch of very interesting positive news.
Mm-hmm. And so, John, let's for listeners that might not be aware of it, talk a little bit about delight and what you mean by that in your studies.
Okay, what we spent 40 years focusing on complaints and sort of the bad side of the spectrum. About 4 or 5 years ago, one of our clients, VIP Desk, the high-end outsourcer, said, we've got high-end consumers that have people like American Express Platinum and Chanel, and so we don't have a lot of unhappy customers. But what can we do to create delight and do more for them? And I said, interesting question. We really haven't looked at it. So we went to a large panel of affluent customers and said, have you had any delight experiences? And if so, what? And what we found was the single biggest delighter was transparency and honesty. You warned me how to get the most out of this product and how to stay out of trouble with it. Cross-selling was another one. If you cross-sell me something I can actually use. Uh, Empathy was another. Humor was another. For instance, and humor and enthusiasm sort of go together. At Zappos, they have a guy that if you say you lost my package, he says, "I am the superhero of lost packages. I love this project, this type of a challenge. Let's get started." So he's combining humor and enthusiasm, and that again sort of bleeds over into Southwest Airlines and some of the nutty stuff that they do. So what we have found is that the critical things are the communication and warning customers how to stay out of trouble and the education on how to get the most out and a number of these soft skills, all of which don't cost very much to deliver, but lead to dramatically higher word of mouth, much more willingness to pay more for the product, which means you can expand your margins, and the education reduces problems because the customer doesn't get into trouble because you warned them how to stay out of it. So it's a win-win-win, and the employees feel really good about doing that kind of delighter.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, John. Thanks for that explanation. So circling back now to the findings in the study and the 40% delight, I mean, I'm astounded by that. What's your take on it?
Well, what we find is that, and this again is an area supervisors get very nervous when I talk about this, is that you basically arm the staff with 5 to 7 different approaches to delight and say, go forth and have a good time. And you pick what you want to do in a particular situation. And basically, by empowering the front line and giving them flexibility, you then end up with this ability to deliver high levels of delight. And it's also reinforced by research by Paul Zak at Claremont College, who found that he's a neuroeconomist, if you can get your head around that. But what he did was he took blood from thousands of service employees and found that when they're in a high recognition, high flexibility environment, they have twice the oxytocin in their brain. And so the correlation with I love coming to work is 0.77. So by empowering the front line and recognizing them and saying, have a good time, be enthusiastic, be humorous. And yes, not everything's going to work, but if we can do it 90% of the time, you have dramatically happier employees and you can achieve these 40% delight levels.
Mm-hmm. So, John, is this like, I remember Ritz-Carlton rolled something out that gave their frontline employees a certain amount of spend that they could do with the customer and so forth. Is that similar to what you're referring to?
Yes, it is, but in fact, in my article, making delight intentional,
Mm-hmm.
I make the point you don't have to spend a lot of money because what we found was that the delighters that were just behavioral or educational, where I'm not spending any money, I'm just saying I'm the superhero, and by the way, here's how to avoid problems. Those are as effective as me giving you $100 refund or something like that. Now,
Mm-hmm.
the money certainly is helpful, but what we basically found in a lot of cases, if I give you a clear, believable explanation, I don't necessarily need to pay you as much. And in fact, I recently had a LinkedIn post where I talked about two transportation companies that I won't get into, who I had a disaster. And they basically said, okay, we gave you 20,000 miles and we gave you $100 credit. We're done. You're happy. And it was, no, I didn't get much empathy and I didn't get an explanation as to how you were going to input in this into the continuous improvement process, because the $100 isn't that important to me, but knowing that I'm not going to ever have this again would be much more important. And in both cases, I had asked the front line that I was dealing with, do you have input into a continuous improvement process where hopefully this will get fixed, because it was a process problem? And in all cases, the answer was no.
Hmm.
So it's as important to give me the 20,000 miles as to tell me that you can report this to someone in quality or process improvement who will actually do something with it.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
that
John,
doesn't
that's
cost anything.
and that right, exactly. And what's so impactful on that is, oftentimes I contact some organization by phone and their interactive voice response unit isn't working, or I'm being rerouted to the wrong area. And I'll say something to the agent like, I don't know if you know this, but your interactive voice response unit isn't working right. When you press a button, nothing happens. You just sit on hold. And the response kind of like is something generic, like, oh, okay, we didn't know that. Or, well, I'll pass it along. And I always wonder to myself, was it ever passed along? Right.
Well, and at 90% of the case, it's not. And by the way, there's a worse answer, which is, yeah, I've reported that several times and nothing has happened.
Okay, that's true, exactly. And it's still not working, right?
Yeah, yeah. And
So true.
and so we basically, and by the way, it can be painfully simple. The first time we set up that kind of input system at Toyota 100 years ago, it was an email box that any rep could simply fill in, here's the case number, here's the fiasco that happened, and they would forward it to the root cause analyst within the call center.
Okay.
And what they did once a month was that they said, okay, we got 130 pieces of input from you. Here are two things that got fixed based on that. And all of a sudden, the CSR said, oh, you're really paying attention. Somebody's doing something with this. All of a sudden now I can say to the customer, yes, I do have an effective route for fixing processes.
Right. Boy, I wish that happened more often, John. And by the way, listeners, talking to John Goodman, he mentioned his article, Making Delight Intentional. It's a fantastic article. Again, it is posted through his LinkedIn profile. So be sure and grab that article if you haven't read it. It's a very good read, very intentional. John, the other good read is your assessment of AI and offshoring and the strategies associated with that, the focus on cost savings and so forth. So I'd love now to get into that article and what your thoughts are on those two key areas, because one of the other frustrations I have as a consumer is the the utilization of AI with the intent to save money as opposed to improving the experience. And similarly with offshoring, trying to save money as opposed to improving the experience. So talk to us about that article.
The genesis of that article actually was a global health supply company who somebody that we've worked with for a long time. And she said she'd gotten a new CFO who was looking at these two mechanisms, offshoring and AI, as dramatic cost savings. And she was saying, we need to sort of rein him in and get him to understand what kind of challenges for himself and the rest of us. And so first, what we had to do was educate on here's the damage when customers have problems, and sort of a very broad global number is when a customer says, I've had a problem, you have about a 20% drop in loyalty, which means that for each 5 customers who have a problem, one of those is going to start shopping the next time that they have to go buy your kind of product. So for every 5 customers who have a problem, you're putting one of those customers at risk. And so then we were looking at offshoring, And one of the standard stereotype is that you've got somebody in Mumbai who barely speaks English, but the newer trend is that they've gone to Costa Rica or they've gone to the Philippines where, oh, everybody speaks English. Well, they sort of speak English. They speak English with an accent, but what we have found, and I actually was monitoring calls for one of the big auto companies who is outsourced to the Philippines, is that on average, in every single call, 90 seconds was wasted with, excuse me, could you say that again? Again, and that would keep going back and forth and back and forth. And it was a combination of accent and also not understanding the context of what was being said. And for instance, in an automobile environment, your call center is handling problems with a car, and 98% of the CSRs in the Philippines take public transit to work and don't own cars. And so they really can't understand. They don't have a frame of reference for the product that they're actually talking about. So we have found that that's a major issue. Plus, people tend to give up relatively easily. If I've decided that you're not really going to be very helpful, in many cases, I will give up. And this is the other thing that we've seen, and this also applies to AI, and I'll come back and tie it in a minute, is escalation. What we find is that when consumers are having difficulty, many of them give up, but some of them try and escalate. And what's happened in the last 3 weeks is the Consumer Financial Protection Board, CFPB, has floated the idea of having easy escalation to a human is going to be required, at least for the financial services industry. And what the article said in the New York Times was that with one click, I should be able to escalate to a human being. Now, the implications of that are huge. And it also, and they were talking in terms of both offshoring and AI, because the other problem that we see with AI is that if I'm given a nonsense answer or an unresponsive answer, how do I escalate in a chat bot? And in many cases, we find there is no obvious channel of escalation. And this is done intentionally in both environments because, hey, escalating to a human or escalating to a supervisor is expensive. But what one needs to be able to do is say, what's the cost of the customer giving up, or what's the cost of not letting them escalate? And given that customers are worth a fair amount of money, yes, you're saving $30 by not escalating, but this customer in CPG, the customer is worth $300, and in an automobile environment, they're worth $30,000. So you've saved $20, and it's only going to cost you $30,000. And when you start presenting it that way to the finance people, all of a sudden they say, oh, okay, maybe this isn't such a great idea. So one has to be able to first quantify the number of customers that are being affected by the bad response and are choosing not to escalate, and convert that into a revenue implication, and then compare that with, well, what would the cost be of getting these people to actually get to a human being who can handle the issue? And another one of the myths that I address in another article, I actually have an article entitled "Fewer Complaints is Not Necessarily Good." 90% of companies have a goal of reducing the number of complaints. Well, I can reduce complaints by just not allowing you to escalate to any complaint system that will log it. And so my numbers go down and I declare victory. But in fact, the amount of damage being done, plus the negative word of mouth being spread in the marketplace, is huge. And another thing that came out of the Delight study circling back around to the delight study, is that we found that people who were delighted and got easy escalation and then satisfied or delighted spread much more positive word of mouth. And the word of mouth from a delighted customer has twice the impact of word of mouth from a satisfied customer. And if you think about it, that makes eminently good sense, because if I said, oh yeah, I went to this restaurant and yeah, it was a great meal, full stop. But if I said, oh, and the pasta was to die for, and the guy, modified, he gave me, extra, garlic and this and that,
Right.
now there's a really good chance you're going to go. So stories from delighted customers are much more compelling than stories from just satisfied customers.
Mm-hmm. And John, when you mentioned complaint handling and you mentioned revenue impact and so forth, you actually, just to deviate a little bit, you actually outlined a model in which you can model this. And I don't recall which book it's in, but there's a great model that our listeners ought to pay attention to. Do you want to mention that a moment,
Yeah,
John?
it's what we call market damage model, and
Okay.
it really is done at two levels. It's done at the individual problem level, because not all problems are created equal. Some problems do much more damage than others, and you can quantify exactly how much revenue you're losing per month. And we have a very simple article that I wrote with Kraft that it's a 2-page article that sort of illustrates it. But in my new latest book that's coming out, hopefully at the end of this month, Customer Experience 3.0 second edition, will be, and it'll be on Amazon. It's coming from HarperCollins. There we have in detail the market damage model, both at the service strategy level and at the individual problem level. So what one can do is say, okay, what if we wanted to raise the visibility of our complaint system to get more people to complain, or in the case of the CPG companies, we want to get people to complain to us as opposed to the retailer, because the retailer's not doing us a lot of favors. So we want to raise the visibility. How do we justify to finance that we really want to get another 50,000 complaints, because that's going to be another $40 million in revenue that we're going to retain that otherwise would have been lost.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really quantifying the status quo to say, given the status quo, how much revenue are we leaving on the table? And then how much of that can we take off the table if we had a more aggressive customer service system? And what we found across all industries is that about 50% of all your customer attrition is due to customers having problems that aren't being well handled.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're an insurance company and you're losing 12% of your customers a year, you could reduce your churn from 12% to 6% by having a more aggressive service system. And we've actually done that with companies like Aflac, Allstate, USAA. To their credit, their CEOs have said, and I'm using example numbers here, we're running at and Chick-fil-A would be a good example, we're running at a 94% satisfaction level. How much of that 6% remaining is easy no-brainers that we could fix, thereby taking that money off the table and keeping it? And what we find is, even when you're running at 94%, there are no-brainers in that last 6%.
Mm-hmm. Makes total sense to me, John. And I just want to add for our listeners, John mentioned his new book coming out. John's books, along with his, I think you have a co-author on occasion, his books are filled with research and data. These are not how-to books. These are really detailed, step-by-step modeling that you can use, backed by solid research. I just can't emphasize enough the difference between what John is writing in terms of customer experience and some of these, here are the 10 things to improve your customer experience, with no research, nothing to back it up. But with John's books, you've got the research, you've got the analytics, you've got the models, and you've got years of research and history behind it. So I'm going to put a plug in for your book too, John, because I just have found them to be so much more effective in actually producing results.
Well, actually, you've also hit on what the other requirement is for both offshoring and for AI that is really not done very well, which is measurement. Uh,
Mm,
there are, let me use AI. There are basically two ways AI is being used. AI is being used for response, working off of knowledge management systems. And then there is generative AI, where I'm being creative and God forbid, pulling data from outside the company databases. Uh, what we have said is definitely in the former and especially for the latter one, where you're using data that may be suspect, you need to be measuring customer satisfaction and outcomes on every single transaction. In other words, there are two approaches to that. One is you can do a survey. The only problem with that is the world's being buried in surveys at this point. Or in a chatbot, for instance, is saying, does that make sense? Are you happy with my answer? And literally just ask it within the context of the chatbot. And if the customer is ambivalent or says no, then you need to have the ability to offer escalation and one of the things that we've come up with is, I think this is an innovation, is that you can have the basic chat bot, but then you can have a flexible chat bot that has, okay, this is someone who's got a problem and is more sophisticated. And let's have a flexible solution space. So all of a sudden you can build flexibility into that chat bot that goes beyond the basics to allow them to try a second time to solve the customer's problem. But then if the flexible solution space doesn't work, then you very proactively escalate them to a real life human being.
mm,
But one needs to measure every step of that. And what we have found is that when people are starting to do chatbots or do AI, in many cases, they'll do a quick survey of a sample of 100 or two, or they'll monitor a few or read a few emails. And it is so dangerous that you can alienate a customer and ultimately maybe get into regulatory issues now with the CFPB and FTC,
mhm,
that you need to have intensive measurement by issue all the way along the line. And that's how, with our CPG study, we found that the CPG companies are really good at handling taste and product performance complaints. They are not so good about explaining why their prices have gone up.
mm,
And so literally you have to analyze by type of issue, because your reps may be well empowered and well trained on 6 issues, but there are 2 issues that they really don't have the necessary guidance or empowerment to be able to solve. So it's got to be at a very granular level. And this is where, if the service system works with the quality system, the quality improvement professionals,
right.
we find that you get a synergy that leads to doubling the year-over-year customer satisfaction. When quality and service are joined at the hip, uh, and you're using the quality analysts to help you do your voice of the customer analysis. Literally, we have found across a survey of 200 companies that the year-over-year improvement in satisfaction is doubled, and twice as many things get fixed quickly.
Hmm. Amazing. Again, solid research to drive these actions that are so needed. John, I don't know if this is a rhetorical question or not, or if you have an answer for it, but why is, in all my years in contact centers and customer service, why are we so prone to taking new technology and immediately saying it can save money instead of driving revenues?
Um, because it's a beautiful question. It's basically that everything is treated as a magic bullet, and the devil is in the details, which is actually one of the headers in my article. That the In general, something works, but for 10% of the cases, it doesn't. And that's exactly what we have seen. FAQs, self-service, chatbots really work very well for 90% of issues. If it's, I got to read I forgot my password, I need to cancel this order, those kinds of things, the self-service works really, really well. And the problem is everybody assumes self-service will work well, but 10% of the issues are more complicated. And those are the ones that these automated systems don't work very well at. But I guess it's because, going back to your basic question, we all went to the same kind of elementary and high school where 90% was an A. So as long as we get 90%, that's cool. But that last 10% is what becomes memorable and can be a disaster and can turn into regulatory issues and everything else. So, and there are there are a couple of lawsuits against TalkDesk right now about failures of using AI. So it's actually starting to the chickens are coming home to roost, I think is one way of putting it.
Right, absolutely. Wow, listeners, John has mentioned 3 great articles. I highly encourage you to read those. And his new book coming out soon, but also some of his past books are just outstanding. They were just a wealth of information. I personally, I would say they will change your perspective dramatically from an easy fix to getting into the details that's a sustainable fix. Not that it's a difficult fix. I always view it as it's a sustainable fix that you can utilize the research and the data and take action, as John has exemplified. John, any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Yeah, two quick ones. The other book that gets more into some of the things such as empowerment is Strategic Customer Service. That is out. That second edition is already out, and it's also in Chinese and Japanese and all kinds of other languages. And the other point that I would make is that everything I've been talking about applies in spades for business-to-business environments. What we have found in the last 5 years is that businesses can be delighted in exactly the same way as consumers. And if anything, the impact on their sensitivity to price and their word of mouth and their loyalty is actually greater than in a consumer environment. And what we have found is that the delighters, explaining your contract, explaining how this piece of technology functionality is really better than this other competitor's technology, educating them on why this is a smart buy at a practical level is a delighter. And all of a sudden, if people are less sensitive to price at the renewal of the contract, you've got a real leg up and can argue to the finance that yes, they're a little more expensive, but boy, they're proactive as opposed to these other guys aren't. So and we've got several articles that focus on the B2B side, and we were very surprised to find that all the behaviors on the consumer side are magnified on the business to business and nonprofit side. We've actually even done satisfaction surveys for the CIA, and you'll be shocked to know people are afraid to complain to the CIA about bad service, but the behaviors are exactly the same. So
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because oftentimes we hear in the world of experience management, well, John just spent 30 minutes talking about B2C and we're B2B and it doesn't apply to us. And so that's perfect that you mentioned that.
yeah, and nonprofits, it's exactly the same. We've worked with Museum of Modern Art, and donors behave the same way. Foster children behave the same way. And I think it has to do with we're all, so far at least, human. So
right, we're all human. We're all consumers, right?
Yeah,
it's so true. So, John, this has been fantastic as always. We love having John come to the podcast because he brings a wealth of information. I try not to bother him too much, but I saw some recent articles and I thought it's time to bring John back. He's not been on for at least a year. So we're really glad, John, that you're back and did the podcast with us today.
Right. Well, it's my pleasure. I enjoy talking about this, and I'm more than happy to kibitz with any of your listeners about for free for on what their issues are, because we learn an awful lot. In fact, as I said, the Delight study was started by somebody who said, "Well, we're not interested in this, but have you ever looked at this?" And it was, "No, we hadn't," and that's how we learn new areas that we need to research.
Wow, that's a wonderful offer, listeners. Take John up on it because he's serious about it. Thanks, John. This has been another episode of the All Things Considered CX podcast. As always, please share it with your networks and stay tuned for more interesting guests talking about the world of experience management. Until next time, thank you.